Alright, good evening everyone, and thanks very much for coming out on a bitterly cold evening to celebrate 100 years since the Battle of George Square and the history of Red Clydeside. My name's David Jameson, I'm a reporter with the CommonSpace Scottish News website. We're the media wing of the Commonweal left-wing think tank. Before we get started tonight, I'd just like to introduce Martin here from the Kinning Park complex. We've moved into these facilities just about a week ago, and we're trying to turn it into a kind of hub of activity. It's already a hub of activity, but more so now that we're kind of attached to it. We're going to be putting on monthly forums here, going to be organising a lot of activism, a lot of media work out of these facilities and the facilities next door. So I'd just like to hand over to Martin, who can talk a wee bit about the facility and our relationship to it.
Thanks very much, David. I'm very, very happy to welcome you all here this evening. Really happy to welcome you all because we're always happy to see a hall full of faces. Despite the fact that the building's pretty cold, the atmosphere here tends to be pretty warm. We're really happy because the Kinning Park complex itself is a space which is inherently tied to a history of activism. We were built as a school in 1916 and stayed as a school until 1976. For 20 years after that, it was a council-run place. The council used to do crazy things like pay for services. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember any of that. And in 1996 it was threatened with closure. Some of the folks that were behind making this banner, which is called the All Welcome banner, used to hang over the entrance to the door there. They were involved in an occupation. I was saying earlier on to Lesley, great to hear talks here about female-led activism, because there's been a history within the building and within the area of activism that was led, and it was mainly a sit-in that was led by local women, and they were involved in making this banner. So we are always happy. This is a multi-use community space. We've got a couple of halls, we've got about 14 different artist studios. The three main constituent groups that have always been involved here are local residents, artists and also activists. That's not always been easy, especially at times when the activists have run the place, because we all know the best thing that activists do is fall out with other activists. But we managed to keep going. We are just about to buy the building. We've been lucky enough to benefit from the changes within the legislation that are around community empowerment. Although, you know, I'm sure there are people like myself who know that can just be about dumping liabilities and responsibilities on communities as well. But at the same time, you know, it offers up possibilities for communities to take control of assets, to decide what services, to generate their own income so that they are not reliant on handouts. We are not a space that particularly likes charity. We're a space that likes solidarity, activism and action as well. And so with all that in mind, it's great to welcome you here to the inaugural CommonSpace Live event at the Kinning Park complex. We're very happy about the possibilities that are involved in bringing, you know, Scotland's leading think and do tank into the mix here at the Kinning Park complex. We've got a lot of interesting plans for the future in terms of renovating and expanding that building, and we hope to be home to many more events like this and see some of your faces all here again. And so thanks very much for making history with us here this evening and coming to Commonweal's first event as tenants and part of the Kinning Park family. And I hope you all enjoy the evening.
I'm very proud to introduce a real cross-section of radical movements in Scottish society today, representing historical struggles, representing struggles that are just breaking out in the last few years, expertise about the history of Red Clydeside as well. We have Tam Brotherston, the end there, who was involved in the UCS working in 1973. Lesley Orr, who's a feminist historian and activist. Henry Bell, who, and I have to give you an apology from Ross Greer tonight, he's been unable to attend, either because of everything that's going on at Parliament with the budget, or because he's still picking Piers Morgan's bones out his teeth. I'm not entirely sure, but he sends his apologies. Thankfully Henry was able to rush here from a talk he was giving in George Square today, commemorating Red Clydeside, and thanks very much to him for coming over. And lastly, Sonja, and I'm going to pronounce your second name wrong, Coquelin.
Okay.
That'll do. Who she insisted, of Glasgow living rent, not an activist because they are building a tenants union, which is one of the most interesting and important things going on in this city and across the country at the moment. Now, I know that everyone in this room tonight is, of course, a scholar of the Labour movement. I don't want to insult you with the very rushed history of Red Clydeside that I'm about to give you before I introduce the speakers, but just to, each of these are going to be giving an insight into a particular part of Red Clydeside history and contemporary social movements. I just want to give you a very quick, rushed, as I say, history of Red Clydeside. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, radicals in Scotland faced a choice. They could either submit to the British state and accept their part in the British state's war effort with and against working class people across the European continent. They could agree to end their own struggles against the government, against employers, against landlords, and against oppression, and take part in that war effort. To a significant extent, the Red Clydeside era is the story of the minority at first of radicals who refused to do this and continued to agitate for better pay and condition in the factories, in the shipyards and the engineering works, and for housing rights through the tenants movement. A minority at first, but joined eventually by tens of thousands of working class women and men across the city and across the country in fighting for their rights, and ultimately as well fighting against the war and the conditions of the war. Now, of course, no period in history is a sort of little self-contained nugget. The things that fed into Red Clydeside began, of course, before the war, in the period of the Great Unrest between 1911 and 1913. And there was an important strike in the south side of the city, the Singer plant. And it would foreshadow many of the events of the Red Clydeside era in that it was begun by women workers protesting against pay and conditions, but many male workers joined them in industrial action. At the start of the war, as I say, many of the leaderships of the traditional, of the labour movement, of the trade unions, agreed to enter into a social peace with the government, that they wouldn't strike for their rights while the war was ongoing. And nationalistic sentiment whipped up at the start of the war was used to discipline the working class movement. There was a similar picture in many of the other movements at the time. For example, in the women's suffrage movement, some women chose to back the war effort and end for a period their demand for the vote. But a smaller minority of members of the labour movement and of the women's movement refused to do that. The first great stirrings of the Red Clydeside era that emerged from that period of momentary social peace were the Rent Strike movement and the Clyde Workers' Committee, both beginning early in 1915. The women's rent strike movement reached absolutely massive proportions, and by the end of 1915 it had won serious concessions from the state, who at first resisted but were brought down by the intensity of those strikes, and the state was forced to intercede and to reset rent levels to their pre-war level, because in this very area where we are right now, in Kinning Park, in Govan, in many of the working class communities that surround Glasgow city centre proper, these were where the great arms and munitions factories were. This is where labour was drawn from the rest of Britain and from all over the empire to feed the burgeoning war machine, and bosses in these areas were making gigantic profits. As that labour was sucked in, landlords hiked rent on the properties to take advantage of that situation, and it was this kind of war profiteering, even as working class men from these areas were being slaughtered. The rich who sent them to war were massively increasing their profits, and it was anger around these sorts of issues that led to movements like the rent strike movement. So the rent strike movement proper peaked with that victory late in 1915. At the same time, industrial workers in these plants in areas like Kinning Park, they were breaking from official trade union leaderships, refusing to engage any longer in the social peace, and were striking for improved pay and conditions and setting up their own organisations to do so in unions that were much more broken from the state and the status quo. That movement was very violently suppressed, and many of the great radical leaders of those trade union struggles were arrested and exiled by 1916. I say exiled, they were exiled to Edinburgh, on the understanding that Glasgow was the real beating heart, of course, of radical politics in Scotland. But they actually chose Edinburgh as their place of exile. The fact that the courts had to allow the workers' leaders to choose their own place of exile tells you how dangerous this situation had become for the ruling class. They could suppress the movement, but they could only do so through a negotiation, through handing over concessions to the movement at the same time. That's kind of the backdrop to the events of 1919. As the war ended, many workers renewed their demands for social change. And many of these movements fed into the riot in George Square 100 years ago tonight. The workers were demanding a 40-hour week, which is quite remarkable because, of course, many workers today are making that demand again, either because they're working far too many hours, or because, like many workers in today's economy, their employers control how many hours they get, and it's far too few. So these demands are still very much with us today. The police attacked tens of thousands of workers who were on strike in George Square, and that led to a whole day of rioting where workers overpowered local police forces. This led city authorities to call on the state to send in troops and tanks and to suppress the movement. I mean, that's the kind of the focal point for many of Red Clydeside, but it's worth remembering that the victories that were won during that movement, and the movement itself to a considerable degree, continued to pan out in the years after. In 1922, many of the movement leaders were sent to Parliament, often on an independent Labour Party ticket. After these events, the Communist Party of Great Britain was set up. And perhaps most significantly, much of the 20th century improvements to social housing, the whole idea of the creation of large areas of social housing in the economy, the way for that was very much paved by the victories, particularly of the rent strike movement in that period. I just wondered if I could ask, basically how I'm going to do this is I'm going to ask a question to prime our speakers, and then I'm going to ask them to speak for maybe 5 to 10 minutes on the question. Tam Brotherston, I want to know how that history informed your movement in the UCS set in 1973. Did you hear a lot of the stories of this kind of activism through your trade union, through the Communist Party that was very active in that movement? What did they tell you about Red Clydeside? Did you draw any inspiration from that?
Well, first of all, before I start, I always like to try and convince people, or to refresh people's memory. Take a look around you. Have a look around. Look at your clothes. Look at your shoes. Everything. Okay, you hear that? It's not often people say that to me. And you'll learn. Right. Well, let's stand it up. Right. What you need to, on a daily basis, remind yourself of is that everything that you see around you, everything of any use, is produced by workers like yourselves. The capitalist class is only responsible for creating misery and war. That's what they do. And one of the things that we need to do as a movement is to actually challenge some of the basic assumptions. You know, right now, as we're sitting here, there's a board of a company and they're discussing growth in their product. One man's growth is another man's contraction. So inherent in the very system that we accept almost daily is are the roots of conflict. Are the roots of conflict. We've just finished celebrating, rather, and I call it celebrating, not commemorating, celebrating the First World War. Many people have got a clear picture of why we went to war in the first place. So if you're simply commemorating the act, then you're not learning anything from that. And in the last, just in the dying stages of that year, particularly the article by George Caravan, which actually suddenly opened up, I'm sure it opened up millions of people's eyes, because in actual fact the Second World War, or the First World War, wasn't stopped. It was stopped by workers saying, we're not doing this anymore. And here's how it would go. 1917, a wee Glasgow fella would say, Captain, Captain, Ivan's withdrawing. Ivan's leaving, but what's happening? And the captain would say, the Russians have decided that they're not fighting anymore. And we Johnny would say, can we not decide that as well? And that is, in effect, what happened. Workers up and down on both sides. And then Caravan revealed that the mutiny by the German Navy, and not just a mutiny, but people, detachments of sailors travelled up and down the battlefront. And therefore, the protagonists in that war had to stop, because if they didn't, they were going to be left themselves on the battlefield and everybody else would have went home. So be conscious of your power. That's why I make these points. Be conscious of your power. Don't feel powerless. Now, how did that reflect on our experience in the UCS? One of the things that made you understand in that conflict was that we were simply reflecting the demand of the movement up and down, working class people up and down the country as the British ruling class had moved into its plan, which was to withdraw practically from manufacturing capital. They moved into finance capital. We find ourselves right now, I think it's 70% of our earnings are in insurance and banking. Is that right?
Something in that order,
right. So they took a decision that no longer were they going to dirty their hands in industry. And industry began to contract. And we were the people who said, well, you can do it elsewhere if you like, you're not doing it on the Clyde. We refused to accept that you can close these yards, and we embarked on the UCS campaign. Now, it was a communist-led campaign. Don't let anybody be under any illusion about that. But it was a communist-led campaign where we said, everybody come in. This is not our private property. And the movement took that up. The movement said, you're right, it's not just about jobs in the Clyde, it's about jobs in Dundee, it's about jobs in Dumbarton, it's about jobs in Manchester. And they took that up. And the ruling class knew that. They knew that. And that's why they backed off. But one of the things that we were talking about, particularly that period in 1919, Britain still retained a large part of its empire. And therefore, to that extent, whilst they were brutal with the British working class, no doubt about that, they had the capacity to make concessions to them. Those concessions were extorted by super profits in India and elsewhere in the world. So they were able, in a sense, to buy off the trade union movement. The trade union movement then became very, or shall we say, non-revolutionary. They were part of the system. They were the boss's reflection. We just need to sit down and have a negotiation. We don't have to have any nasty disputes, right? And they had become part of that. That certainly was the case in Glasgow, where the rank and file shop stewards movement was very, very cautious about the involvement of national trade union officials, because they were in the boss's pockets. And I remember one conversation with Gallagher, where Gallagher was talking to a full-time official of the engineering union. Gallagher was a brass finisher, and he was talking to this guy, and as a full-time official, he was a CBE. And Gallagher said, CBE, and the guy who thought of himself as a bit of a wit, he said, aye, just a common bloody engineer, he said. Gallagher said, well, a cowardly bloody engineer, that's what you are. So we didn't miss each other and hit the wall. the effects, the campaign, particularly by the women in Glasgow, because the rent strike was absolutely phenomenal. I just want to remind you of something. In those days, if a bailiff appeared in your street, they were hunted, they were reviled. Now we make TV programmes about them, and we sit and watch it without vomiting. I can't watch, the bailiffs are coming, the sheriffs are coming, can't pay, we'll take it away. They're rubbing their nose in it. And yet we sit and accept that. Thatcher set out to popularise capitalism. She said it herself. She set out to try and rebuild all of the elements of the old capitalist society, one of which was the landlord movement. The rent action in Glasgow brought about various rent acts, which actually meant that private landlordism was no longer so profitable, and they withdrew from it and it began to contract. And they saw that, and Thatcher took action to try and redress that and reverse it. So, the rent activity, absolutely bang on the money, that's what we need today. I don't know how kids can survive today. I don't know how it's done. So, I prefer to answer questions rather than speak. So if you've got anything
Thanks very much, Tam. Thanks very much for that, Tam. I could listen to you all night, but we only have till 8:30, and we need to get the audience in for questions as well, as you say. I'd like to move on swiftly to Lesley, who is a historian of the women's movement in Scotland, and particularly of Red Clydeside. So I just want to ask you, what were the dynamics of women's involvement in Red Clydeside, both before and during the war, and what kind of lessons does that activism have for us today?
Okay, thanks, David. Well, where to start? This is a fine place to start. This is absolutely the right place to start, Kinning Park, because so much of what happened and so much of women's activism and involvement in the struggles leading up to and during the war years and then subsequently were born here in Kinning Park with the Cooperative Society Women's Guild. And it was that movement and others that provided women with the space and the education and the confidence and the learning and the connection with one another that enabled them to build such a powerful and such a strong movement of the kind that Tam has talked about. And of course Mary Barber, Mrs. Barber and her army had their origins here in Kinning Park, and it was Kinning Park and Govan that really was the first spark that lit the flame of the rent strikes, which then spread not just around Glasgow but very much further afield than that. I think there are different elements to women's involvement and engagement, and of course the rent strike was the most dramatic and the most successful movement and campaign of those years, because as Tam says, or was it David? Both of you probably said this, it resulted in a victory for working people. But that was just one part of women's involvement, women's agency and activism in those years. Of course, there had been and there continued to be the movement for votes for women, both the constitutional and the militant section of that movement that had different faces and different arguments. And many people think it was largely a kind of middle and upper class women's movement, but there were plenty of working class women who were involved in that as well, and who saw it not just about the vote as an end in itself, but the vote to make other women's lives better. And that was true of someone like Helen Crawford. You'll know all about Helen, Tam, from your Communist Party involvement, but But Helen was, I think, somebody who connected the different elements of women's activism. She had been a militant suffragette, and she started doing that. She started campaigning because she believed in women. That was where her feminism was born. She believed in the power of women once it was awakened, empowered, and organised. And that was really part of what she wanted to do. And she was in the militant suffrage movement, and through that movement, learned the strategies and the methods of militancy that she took into, and I think influenced both the rent strike movement and the anti-war campaign and war resistance movement that was very active here in Glasgow and in the areas around Glasgow. And the Women's Peace Crusade really was a movement, a grassroots, direct action, socialist women's movement for working women, as the rent strike was as well. You know, it was housewives, it was women in their own communities, in their own homes, connecting with one another, supporting and showing solidarity with the Clyde, the Workers' Committee, and you know what was going on in industrial context, the factories and so on. But I think the anti-war movement was a really significant element of that, because one of the things that Helen and Mary Barber and Agnes Dolan and some of these other leading activist women knew made a difference was to get out onto the streets, to be visible. The mass protests, the rallies, the processions, the colour, the drama of that was, I think, a significant element. It was like, you know, women, not just that women should be heard after generations and centuries of being silenced, but that they should be seen, and seen in public space and not just in, you know, in a domestic environment. And that was, that took a lot of courage. It took a lot of boldness, you know, in the environment, the war state, and the intensity of the patriotic propaganda, and you know, this was the city of all the cities in Britain where where people just kept getting out onto the streets and making their presence felt and protesting as they did, you know, through the rent strike, outside the courts, you know, forcing the hand of the state, protesting against the war, protesting against prices, food shortages, the way food was distributed in the city, and making the connections between their campaign here in the city and what was going on elsewhere. Helen and her comrades knew that, you know, it was a war, this was a capitalist imperialist war, it wasn't a war they wanted to support or be involved in, and they sustained and built their links with the international movement. And of course the Russian Revolution of 1917, you know, the March Revolution, began with food drives, with women, with International Women's Day, and women in Leningrad, St. Petersburg as it was, you know, getting out onto the streets. And you know, folk in this city saw that and were incredibly, you know, inspired, galvanized by that. And that, you know, so all the time these women in their activism were such a strong and such a vital and central part of the movement in Glasgow and beyond. But there were also women workers in the factories, the munitions workers, who were not compliant. Well, there were plenty that were, you know, but who really were part of that resistance movement, and who supported the male trade unionists, even in the midst of the dilution debates about, you know, craft and protecting the different crafts. But right through to 1919 and beyond, when Mary Barber and Eleanor Stewart and others continued as councillors, really promoting and working for practical municipal socialism, for decent houses, for health, for the well-being of women and children, for the right of women to control their reproduction, against their male colleagues, you know, the men of the Labour Party who did not do that, who would not support Mary Barber's initiatives, you know, to the welfare clinics, the birth control information. So they were brave, bold, pioneering women, and they really made a difference. And their legacy is one that is as strong now, I think, as it ever was, because as we've already heard, it's women's community activism that so often is the foundation for the mass mobilisation of working people for their rights and for justice.
Thanks, Lesley, for that. Henry, I'm going to bring you in now, and I'm going to keep both you and Sonja to about 5, 6, 7 minutes, just to get as many questions and contributions in from the floor as possible. Henry, I just want to ask you about the radical socialist politics of that time. Henry, by the way, is the author of this wonderful new biography of John Maclean, one of the leaders of Red Clydeside, called John Maclean, Hero of Red Clydeside. Red Clydeside, did I say that? I just want you to talk about the riot politics surrounding it and the leadership of people like John Maclean as well.
Great, thanks. Apologies first for not being Ross Greer, but if anyone wants me to call Churchill a bastard, I'm happy to. So I think it's great to see so many people out to commemorate 100 years since the Battle of George Square. It was part of an action that on that day spread across the city. There was looting and rioting in Kinning Park. There were baton charges against striking workers in Yoker and Bells Hill. The miners in Hamilton occupied the mining union's offices in protest against the union's refusal to join in with the strike. So it really was the whole Clyde Valley out in a general strike. And that itself had its roots, as everyone's alluded to, in years of social struggle and unrest, and particularly in the revolutions in Russia and Germany and Hungary that had ended the war. And it's often forgotten how much a similar action was expected in Glasgow and in Scotland. And London papers called Glasgow and Petrograd the twin cities of the 20th century revolution. Lenin called Glasgow the Petrograd of the West. There was a real view of it as a shared international struggle. That end of the war led to a kind of radical crisis and an upheaval of capital and social life in the city. The many, many women who had worked in the factories during the war suddenly were forced out to make way for returning soldiers. There were some 30,000 women working in the shipyards and munitions factories who lost their jobs in the months immediately after the war. And at the same time, 100,000 soldiers returned to the city. So the trade unionists and the women workers and the unemployed feared that they would see the gains that had been hard won in the years of Red Clydeside immediately swept away by a government that was going to re-privatise industry and by capitalists that would suddenly have a surplus of labour. And that was the backdrop to the 40-hour strike. The Clyde Workers' Committee, which was the unofficial trade union leadership, came together with unemployed organisations, with people like Helen Crawford and Agnes Dolan, who were involved in the Women's Peace Crusade, to plan a strike that would both win the support of returning soldiers, but also guarantee the rights of women and workers who had been home during the war. And that proposal was to cut it from a 54-hour working week, which was standard across the shipyards and factories, to a 40-hour week, allowing total employment to be maintained on the Clyde and to keep the trade union strong. It's no mystery that the government didn't want to concede to that. And what is maybe the most surprising thing is quite how frightened the government was by those demands, by those quite mild demands in some senses. The willingness to use police brutality to try and break the strike by scab labour, by moving labour into the city, and eventually by moving 12,000 troops into the city, was a huge reaction. And famously, in Lloyd George's cabinet, the Scotland secretary said it's a misnomer to call the unrest in Glasgow a strike, it's a Bolshevist rising. That probably wasn't true for most of the people on strike, but it certainly was true for a minority, and people like John Maclean, who were moving around the country trying to join miners up to the strike and trying to build a movement that really could take back control. Is that my 5 minutes? Have I got more to say?
You can round up.
Hi. Although the strike was broken by the soldiers and police, and the general strike here and in Belfast was forced back to work a fortnight after the Battle of George Square, the lessons learned and the solidarity forged in that very much went to establish Glasgow as a red city, and the gains won in welfare, in social housing, in working conditions in the years and decades that followed very much had their root in that experience of that brutality. So yeah, again, it's great to see people out marking it.
Thanks very much for that, Henry. Sonja, finally, I just want to ask you what the lessons of the rent strike movement for tenants organising in Glasgow and in Scotland today.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I really hate using a mic, so I'll just speak up and do tell me if you can't hear me. So yeah, I'll just go over maybe I think 3 lessons that we can learn from the rent strike, and then obviously I'll talk a little bit about what we are trying to do with our tenants union here in Glasgow and in Scotland. So as the speakers say, the first thing I think we can learn is that mass, collective and militant action actually works. So when I was reading about it, I think the scale of the resistance is just crazy, right? We're talking when the government said, okay, we're going to increase the rent, and we're talking about some people seeing their rent increase by 25%, right? Which was huge. And the resistance, which, as you say, it started up in Govan and everything, but it was all across the city. It was in every single neighborhood. I'm not going to name them all because literally it's all of Glasgow, but it was also a mass action. We're talking about over 20,000 people refusing to pay the rent increase. And on top of that, as the speaker mentioned a little bit, right, there was a lot, the women that led this fight, they were physically resisting the eviction. So it's true, you have all these stories that are really nice to read about how the sheriff and the factors would come to try to collect the rent, and the women, you know, with their pots and pans and the clothes, you know, and they would tell the others, and they would all come out, and whatever they had, they would just throw it at them. Yes, it was bags of flowers, or not flowers, because that doesn't hurt as much, and also wet clothes or anything like that, and they would literally prevent this eviction from happening like that. So there was a real conscious strategy to use direct action at the time, but also with an element of humor. Yeah, they were really trying to take the piss, basically, at these men. They were trying to emasculate them and humiliate them, and I think we can learn a lot from that still today. So the second important thing I would say is that really they put housing right back on the political agenda. And too often, and again, that's still a problem today from the left and working class movement in general, they put the issue of social reproduction at in the back. Right? So what's important is the trade union movement, right? It's the workplace struggle, it's this coherent male-dominated struggle. While really, you bunch of women, you know, you complain about your home, that's too localized, right? And I think that's really important. What they managed to do is to put the politics of the kitchen back in the political agenda, and they started to also break with the to overcome the separation between the public and the private sphere, and that's something we still need to do today. The third thing is that they, and I think a bit I'll overlap with what you said, is that it gave working class women a voice. The rent strike have of course to be put back in a broader context of women activism, as it was mentioned before and after, and we should really guard against the misconception of seeing it as a temporary outburst of anger by these women around those localized issues, when really it was clearly more than that. And the home was obviously central to the reproduction of labor at the time and to the war effort. And women had huge domestic responsibilities. There was a lot of morals as well in terms of like, okay, if you had problems in your home, well, that probably is because you're a bad mother or you're a bad woman, and obviously poverty, you know, we're not going to mention that. But so I think they really, as you mentioned, right, they were able with this rent strike to get out of the home. They were attending meetings, and they really, yeah, it's one of the most powerful victory for working class women of this country. And as you said, it did bring in the first kind of yeah, loads of acts, right? So it's called what, the rent restriction, rent and mortgage interest bill, or however they want to call it. But it was basically the first rent controls of Britain, which is huge in a way. And at the same time, as you said as well, it really stopped, right, the rise of the private sector and the building for housing for profit. Now, if you try to think here, like, what is the situation today? I'm not going to go into it, but that's something maybe we can discuss a little bit, because clearly the situation is very different. The nature of landlordism is different. The role of the home in modern capitalist societies also has been massively financialized and commodified, which maybe wasn't present at the time. But the demands, they're still the same, unfortunately. Right? Like, we're still demanding like safe and affordable housing for all, because we don't actually have it. And even though there was a lot of building of council housing following the rent strike, then of course Thatcherism, neoliberalism, it destroyed it all, and now we're back into a very powerful private sector, and very few, I mean, all the stock in Glasgow, right, was all sold off, right, to housing association, which I will not say are the same as public-owned or council housing. And I'd like just to finish a bit on like the tenants movement today, because there has been a revival of it, right, all across the world, all across Europe, you know, from Spain, Ireland to in England, overseas, and I think that's normal, because as you said, you know, what is our hope? We're the generation rent, you know, which sounds really bad, but yeah, on average, it's like 40% of our incomes goes towards the rent. And I would just never be able to buy my home. Like, that's just something that will just never happen. And I think, like, yeah, we're all faced by this, and that's why I think it has been reviving a bit. And also, I would say, like, I don't know, for me, the reason why I joined as well this tenants union was after the Grenfell Tower fire, because I was just like, okay, something needs to be done, because people should not be killed burning in a tower for lack of money. So, what is our task today is to, how do we collectivize power? And of course, if you are luckily in a workplace, you can sometimes join a trade union. But by the time you get home, who is going to defend like your life back home? And that's where I think we come in as a tenants union. We want to build neighborhood power, power from below. We want to empower working class and to create, again, a new identity as tenants. And another, the quick lesson, I think, also from the rent strike is to make sure that we build an independent tenants union. We do not want to use the existing political channel. We do not want to use official campaigns, because this is also a consequence, I think, of what happened after the rent strike, is that it was an institutionalization of domestic matter, and therefore it became this kind of thing led to the expert and, you know, housing people or whatever. Well, really, what we need to do is to ensure that, this doesn't displace the militancy that can take place in the movement. So, Mary Barber's army, right, I would say is incarnated in the work that we do with Living Rent. So we are an independent, members-led democratic union. We use direct action to intend to shift the power between the tenants and the landlords. We gate crash, you know, the super fancy galas of the Scottish Association of Landlords with giant checks, you know, of like bank of illegal fees to claim back what they took from us. We try to ameliorate, obviously, the condition of our members. We confront those slum landlords. We go and, you know, not yet chase them, you know, but we are on our way. We go and knock on their door. We go to the agency. We picket them. We make sure that they can't avoid us. We also try to influence policy, right? So the rent pressure zone, the new tenancy agreement, okay, it wasn't us, but we were part of making sure that this happened to give more rights to tenants. Now we're calling on a winter break, which would prevent any evictions during the winter months, which again would be helpful to stop having people dying on the street of Scotland. And we do a bit the same as they did to resist eviction. I think there's a great history in Glasgow, right? I can think of the Glasgow Girls as a more modern day example of how you resisted, maybe not with pots and pans, but with a text message. Fine, we'll use that if we have to. And the way that we organize collectively to prevent the eviction of 300 asylum seekers against Circle, I think really shows the power that we have when we fight together. And I'll end on saying that, like, we don't provide a service, right? We're not shelter, we're not a charity, we're not going to do the work for people, but we're going to make sure that you're going to be able and have the confidence to fight for yourself. And we're going to continue as well to educate ourselves onto the housing question, so we don't leave it to in the hands of the expert. So I'd say that, like, if you're not a landlord, I hope you're not, then you really ought to be part of Living Rent, because just think about, can we go back to this sort of militancy? Well, think about it, right? If we only organize maybe 10% of private tenants, and it's not all of the tenants, but that would make us like 30,000 strong in Glasgow. And if there are 30,000 strong people like us in every single neighborhood, then I really think that the Clyde can be red or even redder. So.
Four excellent speakers there, and in their timekeeping, each exercised perfect Bolshevik discipline. So I hope they'll be followed in that. So I want to throw open to questions from the floor, and about the history or about contemporary issues and how that history might inform them. And I just ask that people keep their questions as short as possible, so we can get as many in as possible. We only have 10 and a bit minutes. I know. So if I could just take some questions from the floor, just raise your hand over here, and I'd like to take as gender balanced questions as possible. So please raise your hands. You first of all, sir. And sorry, there's no roving mic, so if you could just raise your voice, raise your voice.
A question for Henry about John Maclean. I believe on January 31st, 1919, he was down in England speaking to miners. Do you know if there's any reason why he wasn't here for the January 31st strike?
Actually, I'll just take a couple of questions if I can at first, a few questions, and then sort of field them to folks. So who else has a question about anything historical or contemporary? Over here, sir.
Does the panel think that this government would provoke riots like they did in London and bring in heavy-duty police and possibly military to justify their politics?
And another, possibly, from a woman, if at all possible. Another question? Down here.
I've got one. It's not for the panel, it's really for the audience. I'd like to see a show of hands of landlords and a show of hands of tenants. If you're a homeowner, you're out. Thank you very much.
One or two. Okay.
Thanks, guys. I'm coming for you guys.
Can I field those? People just think the questions right now. Oh, sorry, another question down here.
Sorry, I was just going to say quite a few times connectedness get mentioned, and I'm wondering what we can do to actually start connecting people again, because there's just been so much politics of division, different groups of people have been taught and isolated, and I think one of the biggest problems we have is we don't have that connectedness anymore, and actually at the root of so many social problems is people not feeling as if they're supported by other people.
Okay. Think of questions, folks, and a couple first for Henry about John Maclean's actions in George Square and London.
You're right, Maclean was in England 100 years ago today, and the reason for that, he was a supporter of the strike. He felt it was premature. He wanted more months to build it. and he thought the only way that it could lead to victory would be if the Triple Alliance of miners and railwaymen and transport workers could be brought into the strike. So he spent the weeks before it touring the coalfields of Lanarkshire and then moving down and touring the coalfields of Lancashire and Nottinghamshire, and essentially trying to get the miners to come out in solidarity with the engineers and the workers up here. That was successful in Scotland. Scottish miners struck against the instructions of their unions, but it failed in England. And that's kind of a key moment for Maclean politically, where he begins to develop a conception that the working class in Scotland is more advanced in terms of socialist ideology than the English working class. And that's arguably, or I'd argue, where his move towards independence kind of comes in, is in the failure of the 40-hour strike.
And Sonja, just about the about connectiveness, yeah.
I think, yeah, like for sure, if you think, it's true, of course, when you think of back then, right, there was more of a collective, right? I think like the women were able as well to take part in those strike action because they also lived there in the same blocks and the same lives, and so of course it was easier, yeah, to have this day-to-day solidarity. Well, of course, today we live in a more fragmented society, more individualistic as well, and I don't know where I was going with that. But I still think that like the task is a bit the same, right? So for example, in our union, what we're trying to do, we're not bringing everybody in, right? But we're bringing anybody who's renting, right? And that is kind of a lot of people, right? Because you would have, of course, like students, right, would be like rented, people that, well, if you can't get a super, a house from a housing association, you're going to be, right, on a private tenant. We organize social tenants, asylum seekers, migrants, right, anybody. So again, I'll be very biased, yeah, but I would say one of the tools that you have at the moment maybe in Scotland is to be part of this project, of being part of this tenant union, because it actually does bring, workers, non-workers, whoever has a home or hasn't got a home. So I think that is something really, good to bring people together, but it's easier to say than obviously to do.
Tam, would workers in London have been suppressed like workers in Glasgow were?
Ruling classes all over the world admire the British ruling class. They admire them. They say they're so cultured and so... they're so effective at ripping the earth right out of us, and we don't even know it. We don't even know it. Well, I'll tell you why I could say that. We consistently vote for Conservative governments that are your enemies. Right, now that happens. It doesn't happen in Scotland, but we went through the process. We went through that process, and if you look at Scotland's road to present political level, right, it actually went through Liberal, Tory, discarded them, Labour, discarded. So we worked through a process, and it happened over here. Just to underline this point, have a look at Alex Salmond's face on television when they announced that they had won a majority, the SNP had won a majority in Holyrood. He was as frightened and surprised as anybody else, because they had put in their manifesto that they would fight for independence. So he was stuck. Right, connectivity. I can remember, just as a young man, once a month we would have a Communist Party industrial collective. And when I sat and looked around the room, there was every major factory, major section of industry was represented in the railways, shipbuilding unions, tobacco workers, aircraft workers. I mean, you look, and we discussed what we were doing. We didn't wait to see how we were going to defend ourselves. We said, how can we attack? How can we mobilise? How can we... That's what you're doing, by the way. You're organising to fight back. And you'll fight back on any front that you find yourself. Now, that's a lesson. Capitalism isolates people. They isolate black from white, man from women, young from old, a millennial. Incidentally, do you know what a millennial is? That's your Waynes. That's your Waynes. And they've got to describe them as millennials and maybe make them easier to shoot or something. I don't know why. Well, I do know why they do that. They do that to create division so that we concentrate on it. Now it's getting difficult for people to actually describe who they are. Because this week I might be Mrs. but next week I might be Mr. But that's okay. We can deal with that. What we need to remember is this is the works of Chauncey Campbell. Chauncey Campbell was one of the early editors of the Daily Worker. And what he was talking about was men and women and struggle. Great. And it stuck with me ever since I heard it. A bird can't fly in one line. It flies in two rings. And that's men and women. And black and white and young and old. That's what it is. So that's what we've got to work on. Connectivity. We've got connectivity coming out of our backside. But what we've got, each one of us, each one occupies a wee separate space in the cosmos, and we don't talk to anybody. Let's sort that. We're doing it tonight, it's great.
Alright, we've got a bit more time, so more questions from the floor would be appreciated over here.
I would like to ask a question. Thanks. Really enjoyed your talk tonight today. What was the role of Winston Churchill 100 years ago tonight? Because we hear a lot of different stories. And I'm not too sure. The George's Square in particular.
Any other questions? Here's a couple more. Up right at the back.
Do people think that 1919 represented a revolutionary situation, or were there still clear limitations during January 1919 in terms of could it develop into something akin to what happened in Germany at the same time?
Any other questions? One more. Okay, Lesley, first of all, his responsibility for the suppression and so on of events?
Well, I'm asking for trouble here. Anyone that talks about Winston Churchill just now. Probably Henry's the best person to answer this particular question.
Typical East Coaster.
I thought you said we were all united. Winston Churchill. Well, I think he was the one that was required to make a decision about it, and I think it was certainly consistent with his whole approach to as a kind of leading member of the ruling class. How do you suppress? How do you maintain your power and privilege? And when he had people sort of saying this isn't a strike, this is a Bolshevik, potentially a Bolshevik situation. What do you do? What do you do as an oppressor, as one who wants to maintain the power of the state and of the ruling class as it was? You use the resources at your disposal, and look at that just been through a war which was fought in these kind of terms, really, and that kind of using state violence in order to suppress is something that was clearly a strategy and a tactic that was at their disposal, and he was a man that would do that. So. But like I say, I'm just waffling here because I think Henry's the best person to answer this one. But there was another one about, was this a revolutionary situation? So I'm just going to jump in a bit about that. I think from the woman's point of view, from the activist women, and this kind of connects with the connectivity question. I mean, clearly there were people like Helen Crawford who, in their politics, were moving further and further to the left as the war years proceeded, and would certainly, be on the way to sort of looking and supporting what she or helping to create that kind of situation. But I don't think she was typical, actually. I don't think she was typical of the mass of women. I think, honestly, what they were developing a class consciousness based on the hardship of their lives and the everyday struggles. So all the issues about housing and food and money and children and dead husbands and brothers and sons, these were the things that motivated them, that galvanized them into action. And I personally, I think, mostly what they were wanting was a better life for their own people. And some would construct that in a political analysis that would be seeking a revolutionary situation, but I don't think they were. That's enough waffling from me.
I'll jump in quickly then. Churchill certainly was a big fan of shooting striking workers, and he ordered it in the Welsh valleys, and he ordered troops against police mutiny in Liverpool after the Battle of George Square. But actually on the 31st of January he wasn't at the War Cabinet meeting. He had been the day before when Lloyd George War Cabinet inquired of the military whether troops could be sent in, so they obviously were already aware that a situation would arise. And they were told that without declaring martial law they couldn't order troops into the city. They didn't declare martial law, but the next day the sheriff, who was the person with the authority, did order troops into the city. Whether that was coordinated or not, there isn't a record of. But I think the important thing it shows is that the English ruling class wanted to send troops into the city and weren't able to, and so the Scottish ruling class happily picked that up and turned the soldiers on their own citizens. And in terms of whether it was a revolutionary situation, I think it's hard to say. I think a lot of Red Clydesiders wanted to claim that it was afterwards. I think certainly there were figures like Harry McShane and Jimmy McDougall and John Maclean who had read Luxembourg's mass strike and believed that this could be turned to a revolution and were working for that. The key issue, I guess, is whether there was a possibility of the army mutinying or of a police mutiny. Certainly the troops that were brought into the city were paraded at the edge of the city, and any with Glaswegian heritage or relatives were removed from service and confined to barracks, which was because they couldn't be relied upon to shoot into crowds in the city. And so that shows that the government, again, was worried that an insurrection could happen, but I think it's nice and romantic to imagine that it was the edge of a revolution. Whether it was, it's kind of impossible to say.
Just while folk are thinking of a final batch of questions, Henry, what about the issue of Scottish independence? Because, of course, by the end of the movement, John Maclean had become quite a vociferous advocate of Scottish independence. What did that emerge from? Was it from a feeling that the global wave of revolutions was receding and he was looking for something else, or did it grow out of the radicalism of the movement? How does that fit into this picture?
Yeah, I think the key elements are that global Bolshevik revolution was receding, and what he saw was the merger of comrades in Berlin, like Luxembourg and Leibniz, and the failure of the Soviet in Budapest, and the kind of brutal suppression of the 40-hour strike here. And at the same time, he saw nationalist struggles rising up, so he was a very keen supporter of the Million Man March in Tahrir Square in Cairo. When the leader of that, Zaghloul, was arrested, he led 5,000 people to George Square in solidarity with the Egyptian revolution. He was keenly watching the textile strike in Bombay and the Indian nationalist freedom fighters and their struggle, and of course the Irish Civil War that broke out in the months that followed as well. So I think what he saw was a movement from a world socialist struggle to an anti-imperialist struggle, and he felt that Scotland could have a place in that anti-imperialism as both a centre of empire and a place that kind of was a workhorse of empire, but also a place that had a position as a subaltern state of the imperial centre. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. A couple more questions from anyone in the hall. Any more hands down here?
So we've had a couple of events to mark Red Clydeside today. What can we do going forward to keep it in the forefront of the public mind?
It's an interesting question. I mean, there have been quite a lot of good activist initiatives around this commemoration, but you may have noticed not quite so many in the media. Any other questions from people? Down here?
It's more for the tenants union in the sense of if people are moving into the city because rents in the southern part of the UK is much more expensive. People are looking and moving. What does the tenants union? Does a person have to be a tenant first, or is it like how does this interaction with the homeless population and those who aren't renting per se but looking to rent? How does the union work with those populations, or if they even do work with those populations? If that question makes sense. Yeah.
And was there one last question up the back? Yeah, here.
I was just wondering if anyone had anything to say about the kind of internal divisions within the working class movement of that period. It was mentioned that what kind of inspired the 40-hour strike was the oversupply of labour, and there was certainly a discourse within the working class movement at that time that was racialising cheap labour, whether it was Irish migrant labour or labour coming internationally into Scotland. And there was obviously within the intellectual arm of the movement, there was a difference between the sort of nationalistic understanding of the situation and the more international project. So if people could speak to that.
Sonja, did you have a question about the tenants movement?
So, for example, for people who aren't housing secure, like staying on friends' couches, or people who are on the streets, or people who are moving into the city and living out of hostels, for example, where the housing situation isn't that stable. Does the tenants union do anything with that population, or is there a movement for them, or what's the interaction, or if there's been any difficulties with that? Sorry.
So of course, yeah, we organize tenants. It is true, right? When you think of if you're homeless, for example, well, yeah, technically you're not, a tenant, right? And you could be, as you say, right? Homelessness is not just to people in the street. It's all the people, as you say, living on the couch or, in hostels or things like that. Now, would we organize them? Well, if they want, I would have thought, right? But I think, obviously, what we're trying to do, so we have to change our constitution, because we still only say, for example, private tenant, because we started off as a campaign directed around the private sector, and then we realized that actually, no, we can't divide again, right? People on the basis, are you a social tenant or are you a private tenant? So now we're for, kind of all tenants. I would also like to add that, for example, homeowners can also support the union. They can be part of the union. They can pay the monthly subscription. But obviously, they're not going to be part of the decision making, and they won't have a right to vote, right? Because we still want to be a tenant-led, not homeowners-led. But we also understand that a lot of tenants, manage, at some point to jump into the, the home ownership, and that's good. There's a lot of things as well that, we cannot do, right? At the end, I made it sound like maybe more than what we are. We're only over a year old, and we have around 450 members across Scotland. So a bit far from, but we're having a branch, so the biggest branch is in Glasgow. There's a branch in Edinburgh, and we are now extending as well to Dundee, Aberdeen, and blah, 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 I can't remember, another place in Scotland. But anyway, so the point is that, of course, when you move, what do? Well, you can only hope, right? So if you move down to England, there's going to be probably an Acorn, right, group somewhere. If you're in London, there's probably 15 groups, right, that you could join. So I think you just have to be hopeful that at some point we can grow, and the more that people can join, we can double our membership next year. So we have now we got grant, to get part-time organizers and part-time admin staff, because really we just have one person in Glasgow who's doing a fantastic job. But imagine the task of organizing all the tenants. So yeah, I would say that it's hard because we're constantly facing new battles, and sometimes we do have, because of our capacity to actually say, well, we can't, right? But one day, yeah, hopefully we will. So.
Thanks. Henry, very quickly, there were, of course, racial divisions in the working class at the time. I mean, there were days before the Battle of George Square, there was a riot against black workers. What were those divisions, and were there signs that they were being overcome by the radicalism of the movement?
Yeah, the race riot that took place on James Watt Street in Broomielaw just a week before the Battle of George Square shows, how deep those divisions were and how willing certain socialists and trade unionists were to escalate that situation. Manny Shinwell spoke in the dockyard just before white workers attacked Sierra Leonean sailors, and the police came in. There was a gunfight, a knife fight. 600 or so people rioting up the street, and the police came in and arrested all the black sailors and none of the white rioters and attackers. Those divisions also obviously cut across sectarian lines as well, and there was a great deal of division in the socialist movement, particularly about the situation in Ireland, about whether to embrace or celebrate the Easter Rising or dismiss it, and what happened around Sinn Féin. I think the story probably isn't that hopeful, really. I think that actually those divisions did persist and were really a damaging element of Red Clydeside. I think it was more clear how dangerous those divisions were in Belfast, where both the Dockers' strike of 1908 and the general strike of 1919 were in part broken by British soldiers attacking Catholic youths and stirring up tensions again in the city and breaking that working class solidarity. So I think the only lesson is really how important it is, as Tam said, to see that those divisions are created by the capitalist class to divide us and to perpetuate that situation.
Thanks very much. And Tam, then Lesley, both very quickly on how we continue to commemorate Red Clydeside and workers' struggles and why it's important.
Well, events like this, and continue them. And continue them with a view of not only discussing our history, but our future. Because that's what we really need to consider. One of the great weaknesses, if you like, one of the great disasters was the fall. Now, I know there might be some people disagree with me here, I'm sure there will be, but the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, no in the actual character of that happening, but in the idea that some workers had taken control somewhere and that it worked. And that it worked. So even if you didn't entirely agree with what was going on in the socialist world, at least you had an alternative. Now what is it they call it now, the Overton window, right? Which is really to say, we can discuss everything except that. We're not discussing that. And in a sense, that's Jeremy Corbyn's arrival. And I think he's a glazier that's wanting to put a new pane in the Overton window. And they're just not wearing it. They're not wearing it. Information imperialism is rife. That yeah, if you can find a newspaper that says a good thing about Jeremy Corbyn, I'll give you money. Because it's not happening. It's not happening. And that's done deliberately because what they're attempting today is to expunge the idea that there is an alternative to capitalism. And the reality is that there needs to be an alternative to capitalism or we will have nothing. I don't know if the capitalist class think they've got another world that they can pop off of. Because at one time, the debate was only between the two great classes, the ruling class and the working class. But there's a third member at the table, and it's a member that will not be brooked. Their argument, it's Mother Nature sitting at the end of the table. And she can say, you can have your built-in obsolescence and your just-in-time, I'll shut you all down. And it will be left to people like ourselves to actually break that thinking that there needs to be continuous growth in an economy. I don't need 5 suits, I need 1 or 2 that I need. I don't need conspicuous consumption. And that's what they've fed us with. That's what they've fed us with. They've fed us with the idea that we can jump in our own car and do it. The car is dead. The car is dead. Just think about this. There's 1 billion Chinese want the same rights as we've got to drive a motor car. What's that going to do to those on there? And that's not to mention the, is it 1 billion odd now, Indians, and then there's Brazilians, and they all want to enjoy that right. That simple. And it doesn't matter what fuel that you actually put in the car. Sooner or later, the world turns into a parking lot, and you can't go anywhere. So that's the task for us. We continue to have events like this. We continue to discuss clear sky thinking. Housing shortage, that's a nonsense. There isn't a housing shortage. Right? Did the population suddenly double when I was in the Luton? But houses have vanished off the landmark. They're still there. They're lying empty because somebody says, can you pay for them? No, well, you're not getting it. Maybe that's something we need to address. That's a way forward. That's something that we can. So, and just remember, after the war, we built, I don't know how many thousand prefabricated housing. See the idea that workers are going to work out in the rain, not to build a house? That's nonsense. Why they don't build them in a factory? Build them properly, build them fast. Housing shortage would vanish. It's in the capitalist class's interest to have a housing shortage because then the prices of houses go up. Straightforward. They organised it. Thatcher organised it for them, and we helped them. Those people who bought the rent houses. Sorry.
I'm kind of tempted to let Tam have the last word. And, you know, in a different way, I would echo, you know, so much of what you're saying there. I mean, I think, you know, I could, as a historian, you say, you know, I can say, well, the future is not my period, but I think, you know, one of the things that you can really learn from, both from the Red Clydeside and particularly the success of the rent strikes, and also what you were saying at the start about UCS, it's a, you know, you can have the base, but you build an alliance, and it's a broad movement, and you do that by making the kind of connections that people have been talking about, and by creating a different narrative, telling different stories about the way things are is not the way things have to be, which is exactly the line that we're always being sold. And if, you know, with all the, you know, I think there's a lot that can happen through local initiatives that are and local campaigns and movements that are generated around particular contexts and struggles, and then connecting and building the relationships with others who have similar struggles with, you know, under that big picture. But you know, it's never going to be easy. But you're absolutely right. You know, we've got something coming at us very quickly down the line, and that should really galvanise us into sort of urgent action. And this kind of occasion, when people meet and listen and learn together, is the basis of it. Because if you don't share and analyse and learn and educate, then, you know, people are stuck. They're stuck in the nothing can ever change, nothing can ever be different. And the best of what's happened in recent years, in Scotland particularly, but in other places as well, has been a bit of a revival of folk talking about issues and making those connections and starting to analyse, you know, how you counter those. You know, I think Gramsci had a lot to say about this, but we'll not get on to Gramsci just now. But yeah, thanks very much for having such a good occasion, and for allowing an Edinburgh interloper into
Thanks, Lesley, and all the speakers. As the last couple of speakers said, you know, meetings like these are very important because what we're doing is drawing together people with different experiences, different backgrounds, who are contributing to trying not just to remember things like Red Clydeside, but to trying to change Scottish society is as it is right now. And there are big fights coming. So at the end of the last Thursday of every month, we're going to be holding meetings like these here in Kinning Park Complex to discuss some of the burning issues in contemporary Scottish and world politics. So please come along to those meetings. And we want your ideas about what to hold these meetings on. We want you to write for CommonSpace. We want your opinion articles, we want your journalism, we want your multimedia stuff, we want everything that you can contribute. And so please sign up to the newsletter at the end tonight. And if you have any cash to spare at all, please put it on the bucket that's on the desk out there. Can I just ask you to give a final round of applause to the speakers and to yourselves for coming.